The third fence had been cut again. Same precise angle, same clean wire cutters, same tire tracks leading straight through Marcus Caldwell's pasture toward the Willowbrook development. But this morning something was different. The tracks were deeper, wider, more of them, as if whatever had been crossing his ranch in secret was no longer bothering to hide. The rancher knelt beside the severed barbed wire, running his calloused fingers along the cut. Professional, deliberate. But why would anyone need to cross 500 acres of empty rangeland when the county road ran right around it? The answer was walking toward him from the direction of the subdivision. And she wasn't alone. Victoria Sterling approached with 2 men in suits and a woman with a clipboard, all stepping carefully around the fresh cow patties, as if the ground itself was contaminated. Her perfect blonde hair caught the morning sun, but her expression was anything but warm. She'd been the president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association for 3 years, ever since the development had sprouted like expensive mushrooms along the eastern border of his family's ranch. Caldwell stood slowly, his joints protesting the early morning chill. 3 generations of Caldwells had worked this land, and he'd inherited it, along with the weight of keeping it whole. His grandfather had died defending this ranch from developers in the drought of '58, refusing to sell even when the banks came calling. His father had modernized it, but never compromised its integrity. Now it fell to Marcus to protect what 4 generations had built, and he'd be damned if he'd let some suburban power player steal it piece by piece. "Mr. Caldwell," Victoria called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to discuss the easement situation." "What easement?" The rancher kept his voice level, though his pulse quickened. There was no easement on his property. He'd checked the deed a dozen times since the fence cutting started 6 months ago. The woman with the clipboard stepped forward. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Pinnacle Legal Services. Our clients have been using this corridor for emergency access and community events. We are prepared to formalize the arrangement." Caldwell looked past them toward the development. A small crowd had gathered at the fence line, residents in their morning jogging gear and bathrobes, watching the confrontation like it was entertainment. Some were holding phones, filming. One man had a professional camera with a telephoto lens. "Emergency access to what?" Marcus asked. Victoria's smile was razor thin. "Our community center events have grown quite large. My husband's development company is expanding Willowbrook into a destination community. Weekend festivals, corporate retreats, wedding venues. The county road creates bottlenecks that hurt our property values. This route is far more efficient." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. The tire tracks weren't from cars. They were from buses, the kind of buses that carried hundreds of people. But what kind of community events required that level of transportation through private ranch land? "You've been running buses through my property?" "Transportation logistics," Victoria said dismissively. "Nothing that affects your cattle operations." The man with the camera was getting closer, and Marcus could see a news van pulling up on the county road. Victoria had orchestrated this confrontation, inviting the media to document what she was probably calling community development or property rights advocacy. Classic power move, make him look like the unreasonable obstacle to progress. "How long have you been planning this?" Marcus asked quietly. Victoria's confident mask slipped for just a second, revealing something calculating underneath. "Planning what, Mr. Caldwell?" But Marcus was already looking at the fresh concrete footings he'd noticed yesterday near his property line. Footings that hadn't been there a week ago. Footings that looked suspiciously like the foundation for something permanent. Something that would make this informal arrangement very formal indeed. And suddenly, Marcus remembered something his grandfather had told him about property law, something about adverse possession working both ways. The question was, what exactly was Victoria Sterling really planning to build on his land? And more importantly, could he use her own aggressive strategy to trap her in a legal corner she never saw coming? The concrete footings were still wet. Marcus crouched beside the nearest one, pressing his finger into the surface. The cement gave slightly under pressure, which meant they had been poured within the last 24 hours. On his property, without his permission, without him even knowing about it. Victoria and her legal team had left an hour ago, but their words still echoed in his mind. Emergency access, community events, transportation logistics. But Marcus had heard something else in Victoria's voice when she mentioned her husband's development company. Ambition mixed with desperation. The Willowbrook development had been struggling financially, and they needed this amphitheater project to attract high-paying events that would boost property values and save their investment. 12 concrete foundations arranged in a perfect rectangle, each one the size of a small building support. This wasn't for emergency access. This was for something permanent. The rancher pulled his phone from his jacket and dialed Ben Hartley's number. Ben had been his friend since high school and now ran a small law practice in town, specializing in property disputes and agricultural law. If anyone could make sense of this situation, it would be Ben. "Marcus, good to hear from you. What's going on?" "Ben, I need you to come out to the ranch. Someone's been trespassing on my property, and now they're pouring concrete foundations. I think the Willowbrook HOA is trying to claim an easement that doesn't exist." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, you need to stop whatever they're doing immediately. If they establish a pattern of use, even without your permission, they could potentially claim a prescriptive easement under state law." "What does that mean in English?" "It means if they use your property openly for a certain period of time, and you don't stop them, they could end up with legal rights to keep using it." "How long has this been going on?" Caldwell thought about the fence repairs, the increasing tire tracks, the gradual escalation from cars to trucks to buses. 6 months, maybe longer. That's approaching the threshold for adverse possession claims. I'm coming out there right now. Don't let them pour any more concrete and document everything with photos. Marcus hung up and started taking pictures of the footings, the tire tracks, the cut fence lines. As he worked, he noticed more details that had escaped his attention before. The tracks weren't random. They followed a precise path from the development's back gate, across his pasture, to a flat area near the old stock pond, the area where the footings had been placed. A stock pond that had been dry for 3 years since the drought. Marcus walked toward the pond, following the bus tracks. The depression was perhaps 50 yards across with gentle slopes on all sides, perfect for parking or seating. The footings were positioned around the perimeter, and now that he looked at them from this angle, they formed a pattern, a stage. This wasn't about emergency access at all. Victoria Sterling wasn't planning to cross his property. She was planning to use his property for what looked like an outdoor amphitheater. But as Marcus studied the layout, he remembered something from his grandfather's old property documents, something about water rights and easements that might give him exactly the legal weapon he needed. The sound of approaching vehicles made him turn. 3 white pickup trucks with Willowbrook HOA logos were driving across his pasture, heading straight for the pond. Each truck carried construction materials and workers. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were simply taking what they wanted. The rancher walked directly toward the lead truck, his boots crushing the dry grass with each step. The workers had already begun unloading steel beams and what looked like staging equipment. Professional construction materials that must have cost thousands of dollars. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. The foreman, a burly man in a hard hat, looked up as Marcus approached. "You Marcus Caldwell? This is my property. You need to stop what you're doing and leave." The foreman pulled a folded paper from his clipboard. "Got a work order here signed by Victoria Sterling. Says we're building a community event platform for emergency evacuations and neighborhood gatherings." Caldwell examined the document. It looked official, complete with architectural drawings and permit numbers. But the permit was issued by Willowbrook Development, not the county. "This isn't a valid building permit for my property. Look, pal, I just follow orders. You got a problem, take it up with the lady who's paying me." Another truck was arriving, this one carrying portable toilets and electrical equipment. Marcus felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just an amphitheater. They were building infrastructure for major events, the kind that would bring hundreds of people across his ranch every weekend. His phone buzzed with a text from Ben. 5 minutes out. Don't sign anything." The rancher looked back toward the house and saw something that made his blood run cold. A surveyor was setting up equipment near his property line, taking measurements and driving stakes into the ground. Professional surveying that would create an official record of whatever they were claiming. "Stop," Marcus called to the surveyor. "You don't have permission to survey my land." The young man looked nervous but continued working. Mrs. Sterling said this was part of the easement documentation process. But her husband, Mr. Sterling, he's the one who actually owns Sterling Development. He's been buying up properties all around here for some big project. "I'm just doing my job." Mr. Sterling, Victoria's husband and the real power behind this land grab. The rancher realized they weren't dealing with just an overzealous HOA president, but a professional development company with resources and legal expertise. Ben's truck kicked up dust as it roared down the ranch road. He parked near the concrete footings and climbed out, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious anger. "Marcus, this is worse than I thought. They're not just trespassing, they're documenting a claim to your property." "What do you mean?" "Professional surveying, construction permits, official work orders. They're building a paper trail that makes it look like they have legal right to use this land. If this goes on much longer, they could claim you gave implied consent." The foreman had stopped unloading and was watching their conversation with obvious interest. Marcus noticed the man was taking pictures with his phone, probably documenting Marcus's presence at the construction site as evidence that he was aware of and allowing the work to proceed. Ben pulled Marcus aside, speaking quietly. "There's something you need to know about prescriptive easements in this state. If they can show continuous use of your property for 1 year, combined with your knowledge and apparent acceptance, they can petition the court for permanent access rights." "How long have they been crossing my property?" "You said 6 months. That means we have 6 months to stop them, or they could own a piece of your ranch forever." Caldwell felt the weight of 3 generations of family history pressing down on him. His grandfather had fought off developers before, but that was in a different era, when a man's word and a rifle were enough to settle property disputes. Now everything was lawyers and paperwork and legal technicalities. But as he watched the surveyor document the exact path the buses had been taking across his land, Marcus began to form a plan. His grandfather had once told him that in property law, possession was 9/10 of the law, but the 10th part could be decisive if you knew how to use it. If Victoria Sterling wanted to play legal games with prescriptive easements, she had just picked a fight with someone who was about to research every property law loophole in the state. The question was whether 6 months would be enough time to spring a legal trap that would turn her own aggressive strategy against her. That evening, Caldwell sat in his grandfather's old study, surrounded by dusty boxes of property documents and legal papers that hadn't been opened in decades. The room smelled of leather and old paper, and the worn wooden desk still bore coffee stains from his father's late-night planning sessions. Somewhere in these documents was the answer he needed, if his grandfather's stories about outwitting developers were more than family folklore. Ben had left 2 hours earlier with a promise to research prescriptive easement laws. But the rancher knew this fight would require more than defensive legal maneuvers. Victoria Sterling and her husband's development company had resources, lawyers, and time. What they didn't have was intimate knowledge of this particular piece of land and its legal history. The first breakthrough came in a manila folder marked Water Rights 1952. Inside, Caldwell found his grandfather's correspondence with the State Water Authority regarding the stock pond that Sterling Development was now using for their amphitheater foundation. The pond wasn't just a depression in the ground, it was a legally designated water retention facility with specific environmental protections under state law. More importantly, the documents showed that the pond's watershed extended beyond the ranch boundaries, including runoff from the Willowbrook development itself. By building permanent structures around the pond, Sterling Development was potentially violating state environmental regulations regarding water drainage and flood control, but the real treasure was buried deeper in the stack. A 1958 legal filing showed that his grandfather had successfully fought off a previous development attempt using an obscure state law regarding agricultural preservation zones. The law allowed property owners to designate their land for agricultural use only, creating permanent restrictions that made commercial development impossible. The catch was that the designation had to be filed before any commercial activity took place on or adjacent to the property. Once filed, it created a legal barrier that lasted for 25 years and automatically renewed unless the owner specifically requested removal. Caldwell's pulse quickened as he read the fine print. The law was still active, and his grandfather's original filing had expired just 3 years ago. But there was a provision for renewal within a 5-year grace period, provided the property had maintained continuous agricultural use. His ranch had been running cattle continuously for 70 years. The rancher reached for his phone and called Ben, despite the late hour. When his friend answered, there was exhaustion in his voice, but it quickly shifted to excitement as Caldwell explained his discovery. "Marcus, this could work," Ben said, papers rustling in the background. "Agricultural preservation zones trump easement claims because they prohibit commercial use entirely. If we can prove continuous agricultural operation and file for renewal, we can make their amphitheater project illegal retroactively. What about the construction they've already started? That's the beautiful part. Any structures built during the grace period before renewal filing become automatically non-compliant. They'd be required by law to remove everything and restore the land to agricultural condition at their own expense. Caldwell leaned back in his grandfather's chair, feeling the old leather creak beneath him. Victoria Sterling thought she was playing chess, but she had just walked into a legal trap that had been waiting 30 years to be sprung. The question now was timing. File too early, and they'd have time to challenge the renewal. File too late, and the grace period would expire. But if he filed at exactly the right moment, Sterling Development would find themselves on the wrong side of state environmental law, agricultural preservation statutes, and a very expensive cleanup order. The next morning brought fresh tire tracks across the pasture and the sound of heavy machinery starting up before dawn. From his kitchen window, Caldwell could see Sterling Development's crew had arrived with concrete mixers and what looked like staging equipment for a major construction project. They weren't just building an amphitheater anymore. They were creating infrastructure for permanent commercial use of his land. Ben arrived at 7:30 with a briefcase full of legal documents and a grim expression. "I spent all night researching agricultural preservation renewals," he said, accepting a cup of coffee. "The good news is that your grandfather's original filing gives you legal standing to renew. The complicated news is that we have to file before they establish substantial commercial improvement on the site." "How substantial?" "The state defines it as any permanent structure over $5,000 in value or any improvement that changes the land's drainage characteristics." Ben pointed toward the construction activity. "Those concrete footings they poured yesterday probably qualify on both counts." The rancher set down his coffee cup. "So, we're too late?" "Not necessarily. The law includes a provision for contested commercial activity. Essentially, if the improvements were made without the landowner's permission, they don't count toward establishing commercial use." Ben pulled a thick document from his briefcase. "But we need to file an objection with the county within 72 hours of discovering the unauthorized improvements. And we need to document that you never gave consent for commercial development." Through the window, they could see Victoria Sterling directing the construction crew with obvious authority. She was pointing toward different areas of the pond site, clearly planning something much larger than what they'd originally discussed. "There's something else," Ben continued. "I researched Sterling Development's financial situation. They're leveraged heavily on the Willowbrook project, and they've promised investors a community entertainment venue that will justify premium property values. If they can't deliver the amphitheater, the whole development could face bankruptcy. So this isn't just about crossing my land anymore. No, they need your property to make their investment viable. And if I'm reading these documents correctly, they've been planning this for months. The fence cutting, the gradual increase in traffic, the fake easement claims. It's all been designed to establish a pattern of use that would support a prescriptive easement petition." Caldwell studied the legal papers, noting the complex language that would determine whether his family's ranch survived intact or became part of someone else's commercial empire. But buried in the technical terms was an opportunity that Victoria Sterling hadn't anticipated. "Ben, what happens if we file for agricultural preservation renewal and then document their commercial activity as environmental violations? They'd face state penalties, restoration costs, and potential criminal charges for knowing violation of environmental law. Plus, any investment money they've raised for the project would be at risk if they can't deliver the promised venue." The rancher walked to the window and watched Victoria Sterling examine the concrete footings with obvious satisfaction. She thought she was cementing her claim to his property, but she was actually providing the evidence he needed to trap her in a web of legal violations. "How long do we have to prepare the filing?" "The paperwork will take 2 days to complete properly. But Marcus, once we file, there's no going back. They'll know exactly what we're doing, and they'll fight with everything they have." Caldwell nodded, watching the construction crew unload more equipment. Victoria Sterling had picked a fight with the wrong rancher. She was about to discover that some legal surprises had been waiting decades for the right moment to spring shut. The question was whether 2 days would be enough time to prepare a legal trap that would save his ranch and destroy her development plans in a single devastating move. 2 days later, Caldwell stood in the county clerk's office with Ben, watching as their carefully prepared documents were officially filed and stamped. The Agricultural Preservation Zone Renewal Application, the environmental violation complaint, and the cease and desist order against unauthorized commercial development were now part of the public record. The legal trap was set. "How long before they find out?" the rancher asked as they walked back to Ben's truck. "Victoria will know within hours. All property filings are sent electronically to adjacent landowners, and environmental complaints trigger automatic notifications to anyone with active permits in the area. Ben checked his watch. I'd guess she'll be calling her lawyers before we get back to your ranch. They drove in silence for several minutes before Ben spoke again. Marcus, you realize this is going to get ugly, right? Sterling Development has millions invested in Willowbrook. They're not going to just walk away. Good, let them fight. Every day they keep construction equipment on my property after receiving official notice. The fines increase exponentially. As they turned onto the ranch road, both men could see that the construction activity had intensified. More trucks, more workers, and what looked like a concrete mixer pouring a permanent foundation near the pond. Victoria Sterling was either incredibly confident in her legal position, or she was making a very expensive mistake. Ben pulled out his phone and started recording video. This is perfect. They're actively violating the cease and desist order that was served 2 hours ago. Every minute of continued construction adds to the penalty calculation. The rancher watched Victoria Sterling directing the concrete pour with obvious urgency. She was wearing different clothes from that morning, a business suit instead of casual wear, which meant she'd already been to see lawyers. She knew about the filing, and she was choosing to continue construction anyway. She's gambling, Ben observed, betting that her lawyers can overturn the agricultural preservation renewal before the state environmental agency gets involved. What are the odds they can do that? Slim to none. Your grandfather's original filing was bulletproof, and you've maintained continuous agricultural use. But Victoria doesn't know that yet. Her lawyers probably told her they could challenge it on technical grounds. A white sedan pulled up near the construction site, and 2 men in suits climbed out. One carried a briefcase that probably cost more than most ranchers made in a month. The other had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to making problems disappear with expensive legal arguments. Victoria Sterling walked over to meet them, her gestures animated and clearly frustrated. Even from a distance, it was obvious she was getting news she didn't want to hear. The lawyer with the briefcase kept shaking his head, and Victoria's posture became increasingly defensive. They're telling her the filing is solid, Ben said with satisfaction. Look at her body language. She's just learned that her legal team can't make this go away. Suddenly, Victoria turned toward the ranch house and started walking in their direction, her expensive lawyers trailing behind. Her face was flushed with anger, and she moved with the determined stride of someone preparing for a confrontation. Here we go, Caldwell muttered. Time to find out how far she's willing to push this. But as Victoria Sterling approached, followed by her legal team and a growing crowd of construction workers, the rancher realized something had changed in the last 2 hours. This wasn't just about property rights anymore. This was about to become a very public battle between old money and new development, between family heritage and corporate ambition. The question was whether his legal surprise would be enough to protect everything his family had built, or whether Victoria Sterling had one more card to play. Victoria Sterling stopped 10 feet away, her expensive lawyers flanking her like bodyguards. Her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she'd been having a very difficult afternoon. Mr. Caldwell, we need to discuss your recent filing with the county. My attorneys believe there may have been some misunderstanding about the legal status of this property. Ben stepped forward before the rancher could respond. Mrs. Sterling, there's no misunderstanding. Your construction activities violate state environmental law, county building codes, and now a legally renewed agricultural preservation zone. Every minute you continue construction increases the penalty calculation. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man with cold eyes, opened his briefcase. We're prepared to offer a substantial settlement for permanent easement rights. This doesn't have to become a lengthy legal battle. How substantial? Caldwell asked, though he had no intention of accepting any offer. $200,000 for a 50-foot corridor across your property, plus annual payments of $25,000 for maintenance and access rights. It was a fortune by ranching standards, enough to modernize his operation and secure the ranch for another generation. But it was also admission that Sterling Development needed his land desperately enough to pay almost any price for it. That's a generous offer, the rancher said slowly. But I'm curious about something. Why is my land suddenly worth so much to you? Victoria's composure cracked slightly. The amphitheater project is essential for maintaining property values in Willowbrook. Without community amenities, our investment doesn't meet projected returns. Your investment? Ben interjected. Or your creditor's investment? The second lawyer shot Victoria a warning look, but the damage was done. She'd just confirmed that Sterling Development was financially desperate, which explained the rushed construction and willingness to ignore legal challenges. Caldwell's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid you're about to have bigger problems than my agricultural preservation zone." A white pickup truck with state environmental agency logos was driving down the ranch road, followed by a sheriff's department vehicle. Behind them came a news van that had apparently been monitoring police scanners. "What did you do?" Victoria demanded. "I reported environmental violations to the State Water Authority this morning. They're required to investigate within 72 hours when protected watersheds are involved." The rancher gestured toward the pond where concrete mixers were still operating. "That pond is part of a legally designated flood control system. Building permanent structures there violates about 6 different state regulations." The environmental inspector climbed out of his truck and immediately began taking photographs of the construction site. The sheriff's deputy started setting up a perimeter around the concrete footings, clearly preparing to halt all work until the investigation was complete. Victoria turned to her attorneys, her voice rising with desperation. "Can't you stop this? File an injunction? Claim the inspection is harassment, something?" The silver-haired lawyer was already on his phone, but his expression suggested he wasn't getting good news. "The state has jurisdiction over environmental violations. We can't challenge their authority to investigate." More vehicles were arriving. Another news van, a county inspector's truck, and several cars that appeared to be neighbors drawn by the growing spectacle. What had started as a private property dispute was becoming a public confrontation between development interests and environmental protection. But as Caldwell watched Victoria Sterling argue frantically with her legal team while environmental inspectors documented their violations, he realized the battle wasn't over yet. Desperate people with millions at stake didn't surrender easily, and Victoria had the look of someone preparing to make one final, dangerous move. The question was, what kind of damage she was willing to inflict on her own community to save her investment, and whether his legal surprise would be enough to stop her before she crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. 3 weeks later, Caldwell stood in the same spot where Victoria Sterling had first confronted him about easement rights. The construction equipment was gone, the concrete footings had been jackhammered out and hauled away, and his pasture was slowly returning to its natural state. The only evidence of Sterling Development's ambitious amphitheater project was a pile of restoration invoices that had cost them nearly $400,000. The environmental investigation had uncovered violations far beyond what even Ben had anticipated. The concrete poured around the protected stock pond had altered watershed drainage patterns across 3 counties, triggering federal environmental protection regulations. The fines alone exceeded $2 million, and the required restoration work would take 6 months to complete properly. Sterling Development had folded within a week of the final penalty assessment. Victoria's husband had been forced to liquidate the Willowbrook project to pay environmental fines, and the entire development was now in bankruptcy proceedings. The irony wasn't lost on the rancher. By trying to steal his land to save their investment, the Sterlings had destroyed everything they'd worked to build. Ben arrived that morning with the final legal documents, his face showing the satisfaction of a lawyer who'd just won an impossible case. "It's over, Marcus. The agricultural preservation zone renewal is permanent, the environmental violations are resolved, and Sterling Development has formally relinquished any claim to easement rights across your property. What about Victoria? She's facing personal liability for knowingly violating environmental protection orders. Her legal team is negotiating a settlement that includes permanent restriction from any development activity in the county." Ben handed him a thick folder. "These are copies of all the final judgments. Your ranch is protected for the next 25 years, and the renewal process is automatic as long as you maintain agricultural use." The rancher opened the folder and reviewed the official stamps and signatures that represented 3 generations of family determination. His grandfather had fought developers with stubborn will and old-fashioned property rights. His father had modernized the operation while preserving its character. Now Marcus had protected the ranch using the developers' own aggressive tactics against them. A pickup truck was approaching down the county road, and Caldwell recognized the driver as Tom Davidson, whose family ranch bordered his eastern pasture. Tom climbed out with a grin and a handshake that spoke of genuine respect. "Marcus, I wanted to thank you for what you did. Word's gotten around about how you handled the Sterling situation, and 3 other ranchers have filed for agricultural preservation renewals this week. Victoria's lawyers have been sniffing around our properties for months, but after what happened here, I think they've decided to look elsewhere for their development projects. Any rancher willing to fight for his land deserves the same protection, Caldwell replied. The laws exist for a reason. As Tom drove away, the rancher walked back toward his grandfather's old stock pond. The water was clearer now that the construction disturbance had settled, and he could see cattle tracks in the mud where his herd had returned to drink. The sight reminded him of something his grandfather had always said: "The land doesn't belong to you, you belong to the land." Victoria Sterling had learned that lesson the hard way. She'd tried to take what wasn't hers, and the land itself had fought back through laws designed to protect it from exactly that kind of exploitation. The legal surprise he'd installed had worked perfectly, not through tricks or manipulation, but by using the system exactly as it was designed to work. Some battles were won with lawyers and courtrooms, but the most important victories came from understanding that certain things were worth protecting regardless of the cost. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.